Well, South Australian Liberal Alex Antic is pressuring the government to ramp up manufacturing in Australia to reduce reliance on our biggest trading partner, China. Joining me now is Liberal Senator for South Australia, Alex Antic. Alex, thanks for joining us tonight. You have concerns about the way in which we rely so much on China as an export partner?
Well, g'day, Gliso, and thanks for having me on. Look, I do. I think Aussies generally have this fear at the moment. This has been what I've described as being a bit of a wake-up call, I guess, for Australians all across the country in relation to how we actually go about sourcing our supply chains, and particularly for critical goods like pharmaceuticals and personal protective equipment. I mean, we saw what happened early on during this pandemic with the pallets and pallets, tonnes and tonnes, 80 or so tonnes of personal protective equipment being shipped offshore. What it highlights is the need to return some of this manufacturing to Australia. Now, I've spoken prior to today about the need to seek compensation from the Chinese Communist Party for their role in this, and I stand by that. But I'm also realistic, and I think that one way we can kill two birds with one stone is to put a focus back on returning manufacturing from Chinese shores back onto Australian shores. It will, on the one hand, help to put money in the till, but it'll also help protect our sovereign interests. So I'm very keen on this idea, particularly in relation to my home state of South Australia.
And Alex, what about the bipartisan push to have Taiwan included in the WHO?
Yeah, look, I think what we've seen out of this entire experience again is that Taiwan, a very close neighbour to mainland China, had a very, very different experience with this virus and with this pandemic, and it was handled immeasurably well. Really, if the world community can't have the benefit of Taiwan's experiences in not just this pandemic and this event, but also events such as SARS, then we're all at a much worse position than we have been. And so I don't see a reason why Taiwan shouldn't be returned to their place in the World Health Organization, as they were, I think, as late as 2017. That information needs to be shared, and it needs to be shared with the world community.
Let's unpack some of the issues around universities. Now, of course, you know, we've got these Confucius Institutes that are popping up pretty well everywhere. We've got this over-reliance on Chinese students. How do we wean ourselves off this addiction to the Chinese, the number of Chinese students that are actually in this country?
Well, I think broadly it's a very good question. We've seen it across all sectors. The university sector is a very, very good one. It's another example of how we have become very, very reliant on Chinese money. It's not just the university sector, of course. We're very, very reliant on critical sectors such as agriculture and mining, and of course not just reliant on the production there, but also reliant on the Chinese markets that they're shipped to. Now, of course, they're critical industries, all of the above, including the university sector. But one way we can seek to wean ourselves off is by getting the conditions right here in the Australian economy to grow and diversify those businesses. You know, right at this very moment, Australia is something like 93rd on the level of economic complexity on the world. Now, to remove any doubt, that's wedged right between Pakistan and Senegal. Our economy has an opportunity here, and certainly I speak in terms of the South Australian experience, which was once a manufacturing thriving hub of manufacturing after the Thomas Playford era, where we were manufacturing cars and white goods. Now, that's not to say we'll go back to doing that sort of model, and we're certainly not talking about overt protectionism in any form. But what we are talking about is getting the settings right. We're talking about deregulating, we're talking about reforming IR laws. I mean, as an example, we might look to looking at the environmental legislation as well. We've had something like 80 times the number of environmental laws since 1971. Now, my home state of South Australia had a Royal Commission in relation to the nuclear fuel cycle and the nuclear industry. That was ultimately not pursued. It was purported to be worth something in the order of $100 billion over expenditure throughout the lifetime of the project, and that doesn't take into account the sovereign wealth fund that could come with it. I'd say this is money in the Australian coffers that we need to now look at, and we can no longer afford to simply cast off anymore.
I think that's a terrific, innovative idea, and I've been campaigning to make sure that we get environmental and conservation obligations on developers waived post-COVID. I mean, they'd still have to comply with their obligations, but if they've got the money and they're shovel ready, get on with it. Just before we go, Alex, you've got a situation, it'll be very hard to convince universities in this country to actually wean themselves off the Chinese students, because every time we've got a student at UQ who has criticised UQ's pro-China policies, and he looks like now being expelled.
Well, look, this is a very, very troubling case. I am familiar with this case of Drew Pavlou, I think his name is, and I don't know him, I've never met him, and I think it's probably pretty unlikely we'd agree on many aspects of politics, but his strident criticism of some of the stuff that's happened on the University of Queensland campus is something we'd certainly share a unity ticket on. Look, this is going to be a very interesting case. I think the hearing is the 18th of May. We still don't know the full suite of allegations, but my understanding is some of them are pretty trivial. And I think this is a real test case for universities around the country.
Alex Antic, thank you for joining us tonight on Sky News Across Australia. Always a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Gleeso.